April 12, 1946. Yokohama Port, Japan. The morning air carries salt and ash. The harbor water reflects a sky the color of old bruises, purple, gray, fading into something that might become blue. On the docks, wooden crates stamped with American military insignia sit in uneven rows, waiting to be unloaded. The smell of diesel fuel mingles with fish and seaweed rotting beneath the piers. A woman in a faded indigo kimono stands among 200 others, her hands folded at her waist, her face a mask of practiced stillness. She does not know why she has been summoned here. None of them do. The loudspeaker crackles. An American voice, speaking broken Japanese, tells them to form a line. The women comply without question. Compliance has become their language. Around them, the ruins of Yokohama stretch inland, blackened foundations, skeletal buildings, streets that lead to nowhere. The war has been over for 8 months, but the silence it left behind still roars. In the distance, a military truck reverses toward the dock. Its tires crunch over gravel and shattered brick. 2 American soldiers in olive uniforms step down from the cab, their faces sunburned and expressionless. They begin unloading canvas sacks from the truck bed, dozens of them, each one bulging and tied shut with cord. The women watch. They have learned to watch without hoping. Hope is a luxury they buried somewhere between the firebombing raids and the surrender broadcast. One of the soldiers drops a sack. It hits the ground with a muffled thud, and something inside rustles like dried leaves. The woman in indigo flinches, just slightly. Her daughter died in the Tokyo raids. Her husband never returned from Okinawa. She has not received a letter from anyone in 3 years. She does not expect to receive one now. But then the American officer steps forward, a tall man with a clipboard and tired eyes, and begins to speak. His Japanese is clumsy, but the meaning is clear. These sacks contain letters. Letters written by Japanese soldiers. Letters confiscated during the war. Letters that were supposed to be destroyed, but were not. Letters that are being returned. The woman in indigo does not move. Around her, others begin to weep. Quietly at first, then louder, until the sound of their crying drowns out the gulls and the waves and the diesel engines. She does not cry. Not yet. She is still waiting to understand what this means. To comprehend the weight of this moment, one must first understand what a letter meant in wartime Japan, and what it meant to lose one. In the years between 1937 and 1945, the Japanese postal system became a lifeline stretched across an empire that spanned from Manchuria to the South Pacific. Soldiers stationed in China, Burma, the Philippines, and the scattered islands of the Pacific wrote home when they could. They wrote on whatever paper they could find, military stationery, pages torn from notebooks, the blank backs of propaganda leaflets. They wrote by candlelight in jungle foxholes, by the glow of oil lamps in freezing Manchurian barracks, in the moments before dawn when the shelling paused long enough for a man to think of his mother's face or his wife's voice. These letters were not long. Military censors cut them down to skeletal phrases. I am well. Do not worry. The cherry blossoms must be blooming now. But they were everything. They were proof of life. They were the last thread connecting a man to the world he had left behind. For the women at home, receiving a letter was an event. It meant the postman had come to your door instead of the military officer with the white box containing ashes and a posthumous promotion. It meant your son, your husband, your brother was still breathing somewhere under the same sky. In villages across Japan, women would gather to read letters aloud, sharing the small triumphs and veiled fears contained in those cramped lines of ink. A letter could sustain a family for months. It could keep a mother's heart beating through another winter of rationed rice and air raid sirens. It could give a wife the strength to wake at dawn and work the fields alone. And so, when the letters stopped coming, when the postal service collapsed under the weight of blockades and bombings, when ships carrying mail sacks were torpedoed in the Pacific, when censors burned entire batches deemed too defeatist or too revealing, the silence was unbearable. It was not the silence of death, which at least had finality. It was the silence of uncertainty, of suspension, of hope curdling into dread. Women waited, and waited, and when the surrender came, many assumed the waiting was over. Their men were dead, or captured, or lost. The letters, if they had ever existed, were gone forever. But that assumption was wrong. In the chaotic final months of the Pacific War, as Japan's military infrastructure disintegrated, tens of thousands of letters were confiscated by advancing Allied forces. Some were seized during battles, found in captured bunkers, taken from the bodies of dead soldiers, pulled from the wreckage of supply ships. Others were intercepted by intelligence officers, who combed through them for strategic information, troop movements, morale assessments. The letters that contained nothing useful were set aside. They accumulated in warehouses in Manila, in Okinawa, in Guam. They were supposed to be destroyed. Military protocol dictated it. But someone, perhaps a loan officer, perhaps a clerk with a conscience, decided not to burn them. Instead, they were packed into sacks and stored. Forgotten, but not gone. And when the occupation began, when General MacArthur's administration turned its attention to rebuilding Japan rather than punishing it, someone found those sacks again. A decision was made. The letters would be returned. The women on the Yokohama docks did not know this history as they stood in line. They knew only that American soldiers were handing them envelopes, one by one, pulled from the canvas sacks. Some envelopes were yellowed and brittle. Others were stained with mud or salt water. A few had been opened and resealed with American military tape. The names written on them were in brushstroke kanji, careful and deliberate, the handwriting of men who had practiced calligraphy as boys and never forgot the discipline of it. The woman in indigo reaches the front of the line. The soldier glances at a clipboard, then digs into one of the sacks. He pulls out 3 envelopes and hands them to her. She takes them with both hands, bowing slightly out of reflex. Her fingers tremble. The top envelope is addressed in her husband's handwriting. She recognizes it immediately, the way he formed the character for home, the slight leftward slant of his strokes. The postmark is from February 1945. She never received this letter. She thought he had stopped writing. She thought he had forgotten her, or worse, that he had died without thinking of her at all. She does not open it there on the docks. She clutches it to her chest and steps aside, making room for the woman behind her. Around her, others are opening their letters, reading them aloud through tears, collapsing onto the ground, laughing and sobbing at the same time. One elderly woman holds a letter from her son and rocks back and forth, whispering his name. A young girl, no more than 16, reads a letter from her father and covers her mouth with both hands, as if to hold the sound of his voice inside her. The scene is chaos and catharsis. For 8 months, these women have lived in the wreckage of defeat. They have bowed to American soldiers, accepted rations of canned meat and powdered milk, watched their cities be rebuilt according to foreign plans. They have swallowed their pride and their grief because survival required it. But now, standing on this dock with letters in their hands, they are allowed to feel something other than endurance. They are allowed to remember that they were loved. The woman in indigo walks home slowly. The letter burns against her ribs, tucked inside her kimono. She does not read it until she is alone in the 2-room house she shares with her sister. She sits on the tatami mat, places the letter in front of her, and stares at it for a long time. When she finally opens it, her hands are steady. The paper unfolds. The ink has faded in places, but the words are still legible. My dear wife, it begins. The rain here does not stop. I think of you every morning when I wake and every night before I sleep. If I do not return, know that I carried your face with me to the end. The plum tree in our garden, has it bloomed this year? I hope you are eating well. I hope you are safe. Forgive me for leaving you alone. The letter is short. It says nothing of the war, nothing of where he was or what he was doing. It is only love, distilled into 12 lines. She reads it 3 times. Then she folds it carefully and places it in a wooden box with the other letters he sent her before the silence began. She does not cry. She has cried enough. Instead, she goes to the window and looks out at the ruins of her neighborhood, at the empty lot where the plum tree used to stand before the firebombing, and she allows herself to believe, just for a moment, that he thought of her at the end. This scene was not unique. Across Japan in the spring and summer of 1946, similar distributions took place. In Tokyo, Osaka, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. In rural villages where the post office had been reduced to a charred foundation. American military personnel, working with Japanese postal authorities, organized the return of an estimated 70,000 to 90,000 confiscated letters. The logistics were staggering. Many addresses no longer existed. Entire neighborhoods had been incinerated. Families had been displaced, scattered to the countryside or absorbed into the anonymity of refugee camps. Tracing recipients required cross-referencing pre-war census records, interviewing village elders, posting notices in community centers. It would have been easier to destroy the letters. No one would have known. No one would have blamed the Americans for disposing of enemy correspondence. But the decision to return them was deliberate. It was, in a quiet way, a statement. A recognition that even in war, even between enemies, some things remain sacred. The Japanese people did not expect this. They had been taught to fear the Americans as demons, brutal, godless, vengeful. Propaganda posters depicted American soldiers with fangs and claws, burning villages and bayoneting children. Radio broadcasts warned that the invaders would defile temples, rape women, and erase Japanese culture entirely. When the occupation forces arrived, many Japanese expected annihilation. Instead, they found something bewildering. The Americans brought food. They distributed medical supplies. They dismantled the military apparatus but left the imperial palace untouched. They did not execute the emperor. And now they were returning letters. Letters that their own military had confiscated. Letters that they had no obligation to preserve. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could the enemy be so cruel and so kind at the same time? How could the same hands that dropped atomic bombs also deliver love letters to widows? This contradiction gnawed at the Japanese psyche in the years following surrender. The war had been total. The propaganda had been absolute. There was no room in the imperial narrative for nuance, for the possibility that the enemy might possess honor or mercy. And yet, here was the evidence. The letters were physical proof that the Americans saw them not as insects to be crushed, but as human beings capable of love and loss. This realization did not come easily. For many, it felt like betrayal, a betrayal of the soldiers who had died believing they were defending civilization against barbarians. For others, it was a relief, a release from the exhausting burden of hatred. The letters became a symbol of something larger than themselves. They represented the possibility of reconciliation, of moving beyond the binary of victor and vanquished. They suggested that the war, for all its horror, had not destroyed everything that mattered. Among the returned letters, certain patterns emerged. The most common themes were longing, reassurance, and apology. Soldiers wrote to their mothers, begging forgiveness for not being able to care for them in their old age. They wrote to their wives, promising to return and rebuild the homes that had been bombed. They wrote to their children, often children they had never met, offering advice they knew they might not live to give in person. "Be kind," one letter urged. "Do not let bitterness take root in your heart." Another, written by a soldier stationed in the Philippines, described the sound of rain on banana leaves and said it reminded him of the sound of rain on the tile roof of his family's house. He died 3 weeks after writing it, killed in a skirmish near Manila. His widow received the letter in August 1946, more than a year after his death. She planted a banana tree in her garden. It never bore fruit, but she watered it every day until she died. The letters also revealed the extent to which Japanese soldiers were lied to by their own command. Many had been told that Japan was winning the war, even in 1945 when American forces were closing in on the home islands. They had been told that the enemy was on the verge of collapse, that one final push would secure victory. They had been told that dying for the emperor was the highest honor, and that their sacrifice would ensure the survival of the nation. But in the letters, doubt occasionally surfaced. "I do not know what we are fighting for anymore," one soldier wrote. "They tell us the Americans are monsters, but the prisoners we took speak of their families just as we do." Another letter, never sent, was found in the pocket of a dead officer on Iwo Jima. It read, "If I do not return, tell my son that I tried. Tell him I was afraid." These admissions, small and fragile, contradicted the official narrative of unwavering loyalty and fearless resolve. They humanized the enemy, not the Americans, but the Japanese soldiers themselves, who had been reduced to propaganda symbols by their own government. For the women who received these letters, the revelations were painful. They learned that their men had suffered not only physically but spiritually, that they had questioned the war, doubted the leadership, feared death despite the propaganda that promised glory in sacrifice. This knowledge did not diminish the soldiers' courage. If anything, it amplified it. To fight and die while harboring doubt required a different kind of bravery, not the blind obedience of a fanatic, but the quiet endurance of a man who knows the cause may be lost but continues anyway because retreat is not an option. The women absorbed this truth slowly, over months and years. They kept the letters in boxes, in drawers, in alcoves beside photographs and incense. They read them on anniversaries and during festivals, when the absence of the dead felt most acute. The letters became relics, but also companions. A way to keep the dead alive, not as idealized heroes, but as men who had been frightened and tired and homesick, and who had loved imperfectly but deeply. The symbolic weight of the letters extended beyond individual grief. They became a focal point for Japan's collective reckoning with the war. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, Japanese society was paralyzed by shame. The emperor's radio broadcast had shattered the myth of invincibility. The occupation had stripped away the pretense of sovereignty. The atomic bombings had demonstrated, with horrifying clarity, the futility of resistance. In this context, the letters offered a counterbalance. They reminded the Japanese people that they had been victims as well as aggressors, that they had suffered and lost, not because they were inferior, but because war consumes everyone it touches. This was a dangerous line to walk. The occupation authorities were determined to eradicate militarism and instill democratic values, which required acknowledging Japanese war crimes and rejecting the narrative of victimhood. But the letters complicated that project. They insisted that ordinary Japanese people, soldiers and their families, were not monsters. They were casualties of a system that had used them and discarded them. The Americans, for their part, seemed to understand this distinction. The decision to return the letters was consistent with MacArthur's broader strategy of winning hearts and minds through magnanimity. Unlike the Soviet approach in Eastern Europe, which emphasized punishment and control, the American occupation of Japan prioritized reconstruction and re-education. The letters fit into this paradigm. They were a gesture of goodwill, a demonstration that the United States did not seek to humiliate or erase Japanese culture. At the same time, they served a pragmatic purpose. By returning the letters, the Americans signaled that they respected Japanese traditions of family and honor, which helped to legitimize the occupation in the eyes of the populace. It was soft power, wielded with precision. The Japanese people noticed. In surveys conducted in the late 1940s, a majority of respondents expressed surprise at the leniency of the American occupation. Many cited the return of the letters as evidence that the Americans were not the barbarians they had been led to expect. This perception shift was not universal. Some Japanese viewed the return of the letters as condescending, a calculated attempt to manipulate emotions and obscure the reality of subjugation. They pointed out that the letters had been confiscated in the first place, that American forces had read private correspondence without consent, and that the decision to return them was made unilaterally, without consulting Japanese authorities. These criticisms were valid, but they were also drowned out by the overwhelming emotional response. For most of the women who received letters, the act of return was not political. It was personal. It was the difference between a husband who had died in silence and a husband who had died thinking of her. That distinction mattered more than any ideological debate. Among the returned letters, one in particular gained notoriety. It was written by a soldier named Takashi Yamamoto, stationed on Saipan in June 1944. The letter was addressed to his wife, Keiko, and their infant daughter, whom he had never met. It was discovered in a bunker after the battle, along with Yamamoto's body and those of 11 other soldiers who had committed suicide rather than surrender. The letter was 7 pages long, unusually detailed for military correspondence. In it, Yamamoto described the final days of the battle, the dwindling supplies, the certainty of defeat. But he also described the sky. "The stars here are brighter than at home," he wrote. "I do not know why. Perhaps it is because there are no city lights to drown them out. I lie on my back at night and try to find the constellations you taught me, but I cannot remember their names. I wish I had paid more attention. I wish I had paid more attention to many things." He wrote about his regrets, that he had not been a better husband, that he had enlisted without discussing it with Keiko, that he would never teach his daughter to ride a bicycle or read kanji. And then, in the final paragraph, he wrote something that would later be quoted in history textbooks and memorials. "I do not know if this letter will reach you. I do not know if I will be remembered. But I want you to know that in the last moments I thought of you. Not of the Emperor. Not of Japan. Only you." Keiko received this letter in October 1946. By then, she had remarried. She had moved to Kyoto and opened a small noodle shop. She had, in the way that survival demands, begun to build a new life. When the letter arrived, delivered by an American military courier, she did not open it immediately. She set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for an hour. Her second husband, a kind man who had lost his own wife in the Hiroshima bombing, asked if she was all right. She nodded. Eventually, she opened the letter. She read it once, standing in the kitchen with flour on her hands. Then she sat down and read it again. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply folded the letter, placed it in her apron pocket, and returned to kneading dough. That night, she walked to a nearby temple and left the letter at the altar, along with a stick of incense. She never told her second husband what the letter said. She never told anyone. But for the rest of her life, she carried a small photograph of Takashi in her wallet, tucked behind a picture of her daughter. The story of Yamamoto's letter spread quietly through word of mouth, amplified by journalists who saw in it a symbol of the war's human cost. It was excerpted in newspapers, discussed in radio programs, cited in debates about the morality of the atomic bombs and the necessity of Japan's surrender. Some saw it as evidence that the Japanese military had brainwashed its soldiers, convincing them to die for an abstraction rather than surrender and live. Others saw it as proof of the depth of Japanese loyalty and the tragedy of a war that demanded such sacrifice. Both interpretations missed the point. Yamamoto's letter was not about ideology. It was about love. It was a man, facing death, reaching across the void to touch the people he had left behind. The fact that it took 2 years for the letter to reach Keiko did not diminish its power. If anything, the delay heightened it. The letter had survived the battle, survived the censors, survived the chaos of war and occupation. It had outlasted the empire. It had outlasted hate. And in reaching Keiko, it had fulfilled its purpose. The broader impact of the letter returns is difficult to quantify, but certain effects are evident. In the years following 1946, Japanese attitudes toward the United States shifted markedly. Opinion polls conducted in the early 1950s showed that a majority of Japanese citizens viewed America favorably, a stark reversal from the wartime propaganda. This shift was driven by multiple factors: economic aid, democratic reforms, the absence of mass retribution, but the return of the letters played a role. It was a gesture that resonated deeply within a culture that prized duty, honor, and family loyalty. By returning the letters, the Americans demonstrated that they understood these values, even if they did not share Japan's wartime ideology. This cultural fluency helped to smooth the transition from enemy to ally, from occupation to partnership. The letters also influenced how Japanese society remembered the war. In the immediate post-war period, there was intense pressure to forget, to move forward, rebuild, and avoid dwelling on the past. The occupation authorities discouraged public displays of mourning for soldiers, fearing they would fuel resentment or revive militarism. But the letters made forgetting impossible. They were tangible proof that the war had happened, that people had died, that families had been shattered. They forced a confrontation with grief that might otherwise have been suppressed. This confrontation was painful, but it was also necessary. It allowed Japanese society to mourn not as a defeated nation, but as a collection of individuals who had lost people they loved. The distinction mattered. It humanized the war in a way that statistics and propaganda could not. Over time, the letters were archived. Some were donated to museums. Others were kept by families, passed down through generations as heirlooms. A few were published in anthologies, their words preserved in print for scholars and students to analyze. But the majority remained private, tucked away in drawers and closets, read only by the people they were written to. This privacy was important. It meant that the letters retained their emotional power, their intimacy, their specificity. They did not become propaganda or symbols or historical artifacts. They remained what they had always been, messages from the dead to the living, carried across time and space by strangers who had no obligation to care, but who cared anyway. To understand the full significance of the letters, one must consider what they represented to the soldiers who wrote them. For many, writing a letter home was an act of defiance. It was a way of asserting their humanity in an environment designed to erase it. The Japanese military trained its soldiers to view themselves as expendable, as tools of the emperor's will. Individualism was a weakness. Attachment to family was a distraction. The ideal soldier was one who could die without hesitation, without regret, without thought of self. But the letters proved that this ideal was a fiction. Soldiers thought of themselves. They thought of their families. They thought of the lives they had left behind and the futures they would never have. Writing a letter was a way of reclaiming that selfhood, if only for a moment. It was a way of saying, I am not just a soldier. I am a son, a husband, a father. I am a person who loves and is loved. This assertion of individuality was dangerous. Military censors were trained to identify and suppress it. Letters that expressed doubt, fear, or attachment were often confiscated or destroyed. Soldiers knew this. They wrote anyway. They wrote in code, embedding messages in seemingly innocuous phrases. They wrote in classical poetry, using metaphors that censors might overlook. They wrote knowing their words might never reach the intended recipient, but hoping that somehow, against all odds, they would. This hope was not irrational. It was an act of faith, faith in the endurance of love, in the possibility that meaning could survive chaos, that a scrap of paper could carry a voice across the abyss. When the letters were returned, that faith was validated. The women who received them understood this immediately. They understood that their husbands, their sons, their brothers had not died as faceless cogs in a military machine. They had died as men who had tried, until the very end, to remain connected to the people they loved. This knowledge did not erase the grief, but it transformed it. It gave the dead a voice. It allowed the living to remember them not as abstractions, but as individuals with hopes and fears and regrets. And in a culture that valued memory and ancestor veneration, this was everything. In the decades since, the story of the returned letters has been told and retold in various forms. Documentaries have been made. Books have been written. Survivors have been interviewed, their testimonies recorded for posterity. But the essence of the story remains unchanged. It is a story about love surviving war, about bureaucracy making room for compassion, about enemies recognizing each other's humanity. It is a story that defies easy categorization. It is not a story of heroes and villains, of good and evil. It is a story of people trying to hold on to what matters in a world that has been set on fire. The woman in indigo, standing on the Yokohama docks in April 1946, did not know she was part of this story. She knew only that she held a letter from her husband, a man who had been dead for more than a year. She knew that his words, written in a moment stolen from war, had somehow survived when so much else had not. She knew that she would read the letter again and again, until the paper wore thin and the ink faded to shadows. She knew that she would carry it with her for the rest of her life, a talisman against forgetting. And she knew, though she could not have articulated it, that the act of returning the letter, the simple, bureaucratic, impossible act of returning it, was a kind of miracle. Not a divine miracle, but a human one. The kind that happens when someone, somewhere, decides that love is worth more than efficiency, that memory is worth more than expediency, that a stranger's grief is worth the effort of a long journey home. The letters came home. And with them, something else came home too. Something fragile and fierce and unkillable. The knowledge that even in the worst of times, even in the heart of darkness, there are people who will choose kindness, who will carry the dead man's words to the living woman, who will kneel in the ashes and salvage what can be salvaged, who will say, with their actions if not their words, "You are not forgotten. You were loved." And that love, though it could not save you, will be honored. This is the legacy of the letters. Not victory, not redemption, just a small, stubborn insistence that some things, love, memory, the sound of a voice carried across time, cannot be taken by war. They can only be lost if we choose to let them go. And on that April morning, on those docks, with salt in the air and grief in their throats, the women chose to hold on. They chose to remember. They chose to believe that the letters, like the men who wrote them, had mattered. And in that choosing, they reclaimed something that the war had tried to destroy. Not their innocence, not their illusions, but their capacity to love in a world that had tried to teach them only to hate. That capacity, fragile as paper and strong as bone, was the real miracle. And it was enough.